It's not a question of if, but how. France's president hosting African and European allies before the announcement of a withdrawal from Mali. Relations have seriously soured with the junta in Bamako ever since a second coup in as many years and the cozying up of the military to Russia and the mercenaries of Wagner. 9 years have passed since then President François Hollande swooped in to stop the southward advance of a jihadist insurgency and free the far north of Mali. But military victory was never going to magically fix the politics of one of the world's poorest nations. What does this pullout entail? Where to, with the whole world haunted by that messy withdrawal from Afghanistan? We'll ask about the logistics of packing up 2,300 French troops and heavy equipment, most probably to neighboring Niger. The hero's welcome of 2013 can seem like a fading memory for Mali, where the under-embargo junta has stoked anti-French sentiment, a nation whose future is more than ever uncertain and whose ultimate fate will impact the entire region. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what is, in fact, mission abort in Mali. With us, retired General Dominique Trinquant, former head of the French military mission at the United Nations. Thanks for being with us. Welcome back as well to Niagare Bakayoko, chair of the Africa Security Sector Network think tank and consultancy. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
From Niger, Paul Melly, consulting fellow at Chatham House. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
And from Washington, Michael Shurkin, analyst at 14 North Strategies. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. Yeah, a pullout announcement expected ahead of a two-day Africa-Europe summit that opens Thursday in Brussels. Right now in Paris, it's dinner time. France 24's Claire Rush joins us from the French presidential palace for an update. Claire, what's the latest where you are?
Hi, Francois. Yes, here at the Élysée, French President Emmanuel Macron is gearing up to host a working dinner where he'll be joined by leaders from Niger, Chad, and Mauritania, countries belonging to the G5 Sahel, a group that was created in 2014 to fight insecurity in the region. He'll also be joined by leaders from West African countries, including Benin, Togo, Ghana, and Ivory Coast, and they'll be present amid growing concerns about insecurity in those Gulf of Guinea countries just south of the Sahel, amid concerns that insecurity is indeed spreading beyond that Sahel zone. Macron also to be joined by European leaders, several European prime ministers, Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, and those European figures are concerned about the future of the Takuba task force. Several European countries participating in that task force that was spearheaded by Paris and launched in 2020. Several hundred troops with that task force are present in the Sahel. So at this working dinner, Macron, African and European leaders will be discussing how to reorganize their military mission in the Sahel without Mali.
Without Mali. Many thanks, Claire Rush, for that update from the Élysée Palace. General Trinquant, do you have any intel to share? What will Emmanuel Macron announce and when?
The intelligence we've got is that he will announce tomorrow morning at 9. He could probably speak this evening, but it's planned tomorrow morning. What he will announce is, of course, the withdrawal of the French forces and the European forces from Mali, and the fact that they will be displaced, but how many, how, and when, it will not be said tomorrow, probably in Niger, partly in Niger, but you must understand that the French forces and Barkhane is already present in Niger, in Chad, and in Burkina Faso. And interestingly enough, you've got Benin, Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, because the threat is probably going to the Guinea,
the Gulf of Guinea region.
Gulf of Guinea region. We had an attack in Benin a few days ago. Yeah. And so this is where we need to reorganize the system, not only focusing on Sahel, but also on the Gulf of Guinea.
All right, so before we go to the rest of our panel, let's talk about this. France has already drawn down by half of its presence in Mali. And as Dominique Trinquant just said, it's got many more forces in neighboring states. Jean-Émile Jamin has more.
The departure of the French army from Mali, a true logistical headache with multiple implications. The first task on the agenda will be to empty the 3 bases installed in the country, Gao, Gossi and Menaka. Up to 2,400 French soldiers of the Barkhane operation are housed there, having participated since 2014 in the tracking of jihadist groups in the Sahel. As it stands, however, they will not have to join the 2,400 other soldiers stationed in neighboring countries. The Gulf of Guinea, another front in the fight against terrorism, could provide a potential drop-off point. Beyond Barkhane, the French withdrawal, which will take place over a period of 6 months to a year, will also mean the end of the Takuba force, created in March 2020. The task force comprises up to 800 special forces units, half of whom are French. 13 other European countries have participated in the operation. Sweden withdrew last January, followed by Denmark after the Malian junta laid out their demands. Another consequence of Paris's decision is the evacuation of the European contingents of the MINUSMA, about 10% of the forces of the United Nations mission in Mali, as well as dozens of members of EUTM, the European Union training mission in Mali. Despite the mass withdrawal, France will look to temporarily continue providing air and medical support to MINUSMA and the Malian armed forces. Finally, SABRE, the special forces units based in Burkina Faso, will still be able to intervene in a strategic manner on the Malian side of the border.
Nagare Bakayoko, first of all, your thoughts on the logistics of this, because we saw there was anti-French sentiment a couple of months back, and there was this convoy of equipment going from Abidjan on the coast all the way up to Gao, and they were stopped several times along the way. How will the withdrawal go?
This is a crucial question indeed, because force protection has been in fact at the core of all Western deployment in the region, be it for the Barkhane force, for the Takuba one, or for the MINUSMA. And today, in the current context, there are high risks to see the population to have some aggressive behavior. Not all of them, of course, but given what happened with the convoy you were just mentioning, which was really very violently attacked both in Burkina Faso and in Niger, so not in Mali itself, where the tension is far more important. There are, of course, risks from a logistical point of view to have this kind of impediment.
Michael Shurkin, I know that it's a tenuous parallel between what's about to happen in Mali with what happened after a 20-year involvement in Afghanistan. But I have to ask you, what is the modus operandi when you're a withdrawing force and you need to have somebody who's the last person to turn out the light effectively?
That goes without saying. I think it's a question of planning and preparation, and also making sure that people who need to be protected are protected. I think it's a good thing that French forces are basically giving themselves a timeline. I think there's also a difference here, which is that Mali is not at risk of immediately collapsing within the next 6 months. So it's not like suddenly you're going to find that the place is falling down around one's on top of one's head, which was sort of the case in Afghanistan. So I really don't expect there to be that kind of chaotic, horrible situation. That being said, we do have to worry about the longevity of the Malian state after the French leave, but I think that's a whole other matter.
It's not a whole other matter. Let me ask you, because we saw in that report the departure of the French, the departure of the European forces. How will Mali's armed forces fare?
Well, I think in the long term, they're not going to fare very well, because the departure of the French and MINUSMA, well, it still remains to be seen what happens with MINUSMA. The departure of Barkhane basically means that the jihadists are going to be able to operate more openly and have a lot more freedom of movement. They're going to be able to do things like to concentrate forces, to have like larger scale operations with large numbers of pickup trucks, that kind of thing. The sort of thing where while Barkhan's around, if you do a little bit too overtly, the French will see you and then attack you. Whereas now, like, there's just going to be a greater ability to do things. So I basically think that the Malian security forces are going to have a much more difficult time with the French. It's just a question of how long or what that takes. And, you know, I don't expect there to be a overnight collapse of anything. And that's where part of where I do see that there's a difference between Mali and Afghanistan. There will be a problem, but it's not going to be an overnight complete collapse. Plus, also the fact that France will still be in the neighborhood means that there's still a potential for some sort of intervention. You know, if there really is a dire threat to Bamako or something like that, then that's something that can be dealt with relatively easily. Whether or not the Malians will want to call for French help, that's another question.
Right, still in the neighborhood, and the country everyone is looking at is neighboring Niger. That is expected perhaps to host the remainder of those French forces that are pulling out. Back in late November, Niger's president, Mohamed Bazoum, on national television, hailed France's role.
We have a normal relationship with France. Of all the countries that are engaged with us in the fight against terrorism today, France is the country that's making the most sacrifices.
Paul Melly, that was in November. Can President Bazoum still make those kinds of statements today in light of the anti-French sentiment we've been talking about?
I think that's the difficult question. In terms of Bazoum's view of what the strategic situation is, of the need to continue to work with the French, and it's something that he'd been talking about very publicly basically since just before he took office in April last year, the fact that the French and the other Europeans would gradually step into a sort of support role, intelligence, air support, and so on, special forces. All that fits together and fits with what Niger is, as it were, planning for and what the government is geared up for. But the political reality in Niger, but also in other countries of the region, is that events in Mali and the dramatic public diplomatic confrontation between the Malian government and Paris, with some very strong words said on both sides, has stirred up a lot of public opinion. Popular sentiment has really shifted in the region very strongly against France. It's quite noticeable, returning to the Sahel after a little time away during the pandemic, how much one's seen over recent months this upsurge in anti-French feeling compared with where it was at before. And that's a political reality that all governments have to reckon with. And obviously, the Nigerian government is an elected government. This is a state with a democratic system. The president was elected last year, so he can't completely ignore popular sentiment. And I think that's where Niale made a very good point about the difficulty of the practical logistics of the withdrawal. Niger has made clear that it wouldn't be ready to simply accept the whole of Takuba being moved just south over the border from where it is in northeast Mali into adjacent areas of Niger. But practically, the big logistics base that the French operate in Niger, that's going to need to be the hub through which a lot of these troops are pulled out, and how to do it without a great riling up in popular sentiment and the risk of demonstrations, street clashes, and things that become difficult to control, panic on all sides, all that kind of thing, is a really huge political challenge. And in some ways, the longer term vision about where the strategic partnerships, how French or other European forces can work with individual West African armies on special operations and all that kind of thing. One can see how that can all work in military terms in the long term, but getting there politically over the next few weeks or month or two, that is going to be really difficult.
Getting there politically, I want to talk about it with our panel. Let me begin with you, General Trinquant. This Wednesday, we saw the junta leader in Burkina Faso sworn in as president. There was a coup on January the 24th. Colonel Damiba sworn in. We don't know when. He's promised he's going to hand back to civilian rule, but we have no idea when and under what terms. On the quiet, Burkina Faso remains a country that France depends upon. It's got special forces stationed there. Can the French do it with the one country that hasn't had a coup among the ones we've named, Niger? Or does it still need Burkina Faso and for if it wants to patrol against jihadists again?
No, I think it's both. I mean, France needs Burkina Faso and Burkina Faso needs France. And what is very interesting is that even after a coup, Burkina Faso was not putting under pressure by ECOWAS nor by France. So the position is a bit different from Mali. Just I want to go back to the parallel with Afghanistan. I mean, the US troops in Afghanistan were under pressure of Taliban. The French troops in Mali are not under pressure of the jihadists. They are leaving because the government of Mali don't want to keep them there. Second point is that MINUSMA is a big question because the French forces were providing support to MINUSMA.
The UN force.
Yes, the UN force. And if the Malian government forbid any air support from the French troops in Mali, then we've got a problem for MINUSMA.
Do you expect that to happen?
Don't know. I mean, the Malian government, you know that for the last week, the cooperation between Malian army and French army was going very well. But suddenly they received orders from Bamako to stop cooperation with the French troops. And so there was even the UN flight were forbidden for a while by the government of Bamako. So we don't know what will be the decision from the government of Bamako. But if they are stopping any support from the French troop from the south of Sahel to Mali, then the UN as a whole will have a big problem.
You heard Niagara Bakayoko, Michael Shurkin say how in the short term, don't expect major changes in Bamako, but in the long run, we could have a major problem.
I think that the future of the situation will depend on 3 to 4 very important dynamics. First, we don't have to forget that jihadi groups are not united. They are competing one with each other, and presently they are very violent fighting between the groups affiliated to Al-Qaeda and others affiliated to the Islamic State. I think it will be a crucial aspect of what will happen. Second aspect is what about the offensive which has been launched by the Malian forces together with their Russian allies? Is it true that they are very successful on the ground, or is it not? It is a key question. Finally, what about the negotiation process? Because we have not to forget that from the very beginning, the disagreements between France and Mali, and even when President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta was still in office, was exactly about this question.
I just want to remind our viewers, we're 8 weeks from a presidential election here in France. And Emmanuel Macron said, don't negotiate with Islamist radicals.
Yes, exactly.
Was that the right call?
I think it was not necessarily very well presented because, in fact, the decision has definitely to be taken by Malian authorities. And it is definitely one of the sources of the present disagreement. There have been others, of course, but it is very important to remind this because the question at stake is not only about France leaving, it is also because there has been increasingly a very different perspective between France and Mali about the kind of solution which could solve the crisis.
Michael Shurkin, if you want a political solution, you're going to have to bring in people with whom you don't agree. Is that is Emmanuel Macron wrong to make it just a blanket no to speaking to any of those groups, which, as you heard Niagale say, are of various stripes?
I think so. I think, as Nyagale said, there have been a lot of very fundamental different points of view, increasingly different points of view, different perspectives, a lot of misunderstandings, and I think a real failure on the part of France to communicate effectively about its intentions, about what it's doing, about its expectations, et cetera, and also failures to communicate with the Malians and to talk to them. And so there's a very long list of, for example, of things that Macron has said, which might fundamentally be true, but perhaps he could have said it in a different way. And there's a tone deafness that I think is often the case amongst Macron and also de Drian, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Sort of a constant, this amazing ability to rub Malians the wrong way, which I think has really dogged France since the very beginning. And it's turned out that these sorts of communications failures, to my eyes, turn out to have been largely decisive. It's not that France is doing well or doing badly on the battlefield or anything like that. It's a sort of familiar to talk and to communicate in an effective way. I also want to go back to the general's point, and I think this is relevant, that France isn't retreating under fire from the jihadists, which was more or less the case in Afghanistan, but rather it's sort of retreating under fire from populist politics. It's populism in Mali that has overcome, that is now defining Malian policy, and that's what's pushing out France, which is a very different situation. But this also relates to the problem of France's inability to communicate its intentions and what it's doing and its expectations, et cetera. So it's falling to populism. And a lot of this, I think, can be laid at the feet of France and French missteps. Of course, the Russians have been there through their different propaganda efforts in order to stoke all of this and to really take advantage of
propaganda
French
efforts. But to Nyagade's question as to whether or not these claims that they'd had success on the battlefield, have you seen any evidence of that, Michael Shurkin?
No, I've not. I'm very skeptical. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I think this is also part of the Russian influence, is that the Malian security forces have really improved their propaganda game. And I think this change in the Malian security forces communications approach, I think, is sort of concomitant with the arrival of Wagner. Might just be a coincidence, but might not. But I really see false claims. I don't see them doing anything that they haven't done in the past. This is not the first Malian offensive. And I think that a lot of the people that they're saying that they've killed are actually just civilians. I don't really see anything new, but I see also in Malian social media that everybody's talking about what they call a montée en puissance, this sort of resurgence of strength. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that Malian forces are necessarily any better than they were a year ago or 5 years ago, and that the Russian element is more sort of mythical at this point, or magical, or sort of it gives people this sense that somehow everything's better and everything's changed. But so far, I've not seen any evidence on the ground. And I would be delighted if I were to see some evidence, because I would like to see the Malian security forces grow in strength. That would be a very good news story.
Paul Melly, where you're sitting in Niger, are you getting a sense of this information war that's playing out?
Yeah, the information war is very, very noticeable in the region. You can talk to people across West Africa. People have seen social media videos making all sorts of wild allegations about what the French are doing or not doing. It's very commonplace, for example, to have people say to you that the French are deliberately supporting either the jihadists or deliberately supporting the Tuareg separatist movements in the north of Mali, who in fact signed a peace agreement with the Malian government back in 2015, and whose main focus these days is on trying to secure more administrative devolution. But all sorts of rumors are circulating. And I think we also need to remember that this is in a regional context, in a West African context. So it's not just that Mali is having a confrontation vis-a-vis Paris or vis-a-vis the European countries, as we saw with the row when they asked Denmark to pull its troops out. But there's also a political face-off between the Malian regime and ECOWAS, the bloc of countries to which all West African states belong, which is trying to get the regime in Mali to agree to a roadmap, a timetable for returning to democratic elected politics. And so there's a big political confrontation going on there. The lead on sanctions on Mali has been led by ECOWAS, backed up by the African Union, and then essentially European countries have rode in behind. They basically said, we will take our lead from what ECOWAS decides. But there's also another layer to the political rift, which is that many, many ordinary West Africans are becoming disillusioned with their political leaders, even those who were elected. And so to some extent, figures such as the Malian Prime Minister, Choguel Maïga, who was appointed, of course, by the military putschists, they're playing into people's disillusionment with the political class. And the West is kind of France is getting caught out because it's so used to working with presidents, often elected presidents in West Africa, and suddenly it's finding that a lot of ordinary West Africans have lost faith in their presidents. And so saying we've agreed this or that with XYZ West African leader doesn't necessarily get popular opinion on your side.
Doesn't necessarily get popular opinion on your side, and we can actually show this concretely, this growing anti-French sentiment palpable when France 24's Cyril Payen went to Mali last month to witness the mood amid that stepped-up Russian presence.
In the Kalabankura district in Bamako's right bank, we meet Mohamed Diarra. He is 30 years old and was born and raised in the Malian capital. Like many here, Mohamed is an ardent supporter of military power.
The one down there is Choguel Maïga. The other there is Assimi Goïta. And the little one there is Sadio Camara. These are people I like very much and whom I support. That's why I named my animals after the president, the prime minister, and the defense minister. Since the founding fathers of independence, they have followed an ideal. This ideal is to see the emancipation of the African people. I subscribe to this idea, to be able to better address this fight and finally see the African people blossom. From 2012 until now, France has been here. That's 9 years. And what has been the result? Every day, they burned villages, murdered pregnant women, burned them alive, killed children. That's why we need other partnerships. We don't want any more interference. We don't want any country, whether it is France or another, to impose their will on us.
It is January 22nd and a new day of protests in the streets of Bamako. A week ago, hundreds of thousands of Malians took to the streets across the country to denounce the regional sanctions imposed on their nation. This gathering was organized by a hardcore nationalist group made up of young people. Here, there is plenty of anti-French sentiment.
I'm really happy. All this patriotism inspires me. I'm really proud of the Malian people and proud of the African people.
The crowd of thousands marches around the city, growing by the hour.
That's an excerpt from Reporters, the France 24 investigative news magazine. The episode is called Mali, the Russian Path. And in it, you see, General Trinquant, that those who are against France leaving spoke to us, but didn't want to speak on camera. They did so with their face hidden. It's a tense situation right now.
Yes, it's a tense situation. That's why the French forces have to leave Mali. May I add one point to the 3 points of Niagale, is that we're not talking about the opposition. And we are more and more listening to opposition saying, be careful, the junta, the putschists are taking the wrong side. And you've got, for example, Imam Dicko, who was one of the men who was for organizing the living of Bamako, who is saying, don't forget that France is our strategic allies. So we need to be careful about that. The second point.
So what, don't burn the bridges completely with Bamako?
Exactly. I mean, because in a few months we'll see what will happen. The other point I'm talking about is the fact that we are all the camera, and that's right, are in Bamako. They are showing what's happening in Bamako. They are not showing what's happening in Tessalit when the French forces were living. They are not showing the other side. And so currently you've got such a pressure that you've got this sort of reaction. That's why the French forces don't have to leave, because it's untenable to be there. But I think that we will see in a few months what will happen.
I fully agree that the kind of enthusiasm we have seen when France arrived in 2013 is exactly the same as the one we're witnessing with Russians. And I'm almost sure that the result will be almost the same, because I'm very doubtful about the capacities of Russia to change the strategic situation. But you're mentioning the northern Mali. It is another very important aspect which has to be taken into account, because, you know, the non-jihadi rebel groups have been reorganizing in northern parts of the countries and there is a very negative approach to their plans from Bamako. Finally, I think it is also important to recognize the fact that you're mentioning Imam Dicko, but why Imam Dicko has not been seen as a partner by French authorities. Today, yes, everybody is saying, Imam Dicko today is saying we don't have to cut bridges with France, but he was presented as an evil. There was absolutely no way to talk with Imam Dicko. And today we can see that, yes, he might be part of a political solution, and we are always coming back to this political solution.
So let me just ask you, General Trinquant, again, I say we're 8 weeks from a French presidential election. You've seen many French presidential elections in your time. Will it be easier for France to deal with what Niagale Bakayoko was saying after April, once the polls have been... once the ballots have been counted?
You know, going out from an operation, it's like a motorway. You need to take the exit at the right time. Either in 2013, just after Serval, you've got to leave. Or after the election of Ibika, you've got to leave. Okay? Currently, this is the opportunity to leave, because they asked to leave. And I think for the president, this is the chance to show that things are changing. Under pressure, certainly, but things are changing. I think the French citizen will not understand if the French say we need to stay there. They understand that we've got to leave. And so that's a chance in 8 weeks before the election. Yes.
Okay, so definitely time to leave. But what about negotiating with those you didn't want to negotiate with before?
No, but the problem is that the negotiation is the problem of the Malian government, not the French government. But the French government was probably wrong on saying you don't have to discuss with these people. But the French forces were there just to fight, not to negotiate. And that was up to the Malian government to discuss. And I remember, we must be careful about the wording of how it was said. It was said, we will never discuss with the people who have the aim of imposing jihadists in the world. But we will discuss with the separatist movement in Mali, because it's a different sort of movement.
A semantic exercise, Michael Shurkin, or do you see that as the right policy?
It's such a sticky question. I know that for Malians, it's the same thing. And one of the biggest disagreements between Malians and France has to do with the fact that for France has always tried to define the bad guys as the jihadists and treat all the separatists and autonomous movements differently. Whereas for Malians, they're all sort of one and the same thing. And Malians have been very disappointed and angry that France seems to be indulging the separatists in their eyes. And they would really have France go after the separatists and not just limit themselves to the groups that France insists are the real jihadists. Again, because for the Malians, it's all one and the same thing. But it's a very tricky situation, and I'm sensitive to this because I understand that from a French point of view, getting involved in putting pressure on the separatists means getting involved in internal Malian politics, which is really very colonial. And that's something that France actually doesn't want to be doing. It doesn't want to sort of take this colonial role of arbitrating amongst the different warring parties in Mali, and therefore it likes to cling to what might in fact be a fiction, the idea that the jihadists are different from the separatists, and then focus on fighting the jihadists. And that's really been the French position. It's also, by the way, been the American position as well, right? To try to draw a strong line between the jihadists and all the separatists and insist that we don't want to have anything to do with the fight with the separatists because it's none of our business. So it's a real problem. And to me, the answer to the problem that I think that the French should have been trying to avail themselves to has been trying to actually engage the Malians in this problem. In other words, recognizing that there's a fundamental difference of opinion and different perspective, and then trying to bridge that different perspective through dialogue. Might be impossible, but it's certainly something that they would need to try to do.
So let me bring in Paul Melly on this point.
Sure.
So you heard General Trinquant say there's an off-ramp for the French presence. You want us out? We're going. Here we go. We're out. You heard there Michael Shurkin say now's the time then for the Malians to take the bull by the horns with a political solution. How's this movie going to end?
Well, I think the huge challenge that is going ahead is not just the military withdrawal. It's less the political negotiation over the political transition, because, as I mentioned earlier, that's in a sense down to ECOWAS. But there is a real difficulty as to how to get enough of a security stability in central and northern Mali to begin to restore basic services, to begin to allow the state to provide, and in some cases it hasn't really ever provided, the sort of things that ordinary people need. And that's something that military force can't deliver, but you still need some security in the background. And that's the biggest challenge, because the Sahel is an incredibly fragile region. It's subjected to huge pressures of population growth, climate change, shortage of natural resources, and deep poverty. And we've had, for example, in 2021, the rainy season was poor, the crops were poor. There's a really quite serious food crisis that many households are going to face. And although the systems are there to get food to them, unless you have a sort of minimum of security, you won't be able to deliver it. And the problem is, in the present climate, because of these big political battles going on, we're seeing a sort of politics of gesture, unavoidably, really, if you like. But what it means is the low profile, day-to-day function of rebuilding ordinary security, of trying to get not so much the hardline jihadists who won't ever be convinced, but all the large numbers of disillusioned teenagers who've got drawn into armed groups because they've got nothing else to do, restoring basic stability. That's going to be massively difficult. And it's a problem not just for Mali, but for the wider Sahel. In one of the worst attacks in Burkina Faso in the middle of last year, those local people who survived said that most of the attackers were children of 12 or 14. So you've got a massive problem of disillusioned children drawn into armed groups, child soldiers. Then there's arms coming in from Libya. There's drug trafficking. I mean, there are huge complications to restoring basic stability in the region. And in a sense, just managing this high-profile withdrawal with all the politics around it will be delicate and difficult, but it's only a small part of how to tackle the wider Sahel crisis.
So one final question, I'll put it to you, Nyagere Bakayoko, because if we look at the timeline of what's unfolding this week, the expected announcement of that withdrawal, and then this two-day summit that's been planned for a long time between the European Union and the African Union, is it good, the fact that this is all happening at the same time?
I'm not sure, because in fact I think there are lots of confusion. For instance, the Takuba force has nothing to do with the European Union. It is a political agreement.
Yeah, it's national armies.
National armies. It is not linked to the French ESDP and PSSD. So no, I'm not sure. But what is important is the fact that the European forces will have and states will have to decide if they can follow up France in their future engagement in Sahel. And that's far from
with all the development issues that Paul Melly was describing?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because today it is a fact that France is more seen as a risk than as a guarantee. So other European partners will have to think a lot before engaging very visibly with those French engagements.
Certainly, it's concentrating the minds on the eve of that summit in Brussels. I want to thank you, Nyagare Bakayoko. I want to thank as well General Dominique Trinquant. Paul Melly with us from Niger, Michael Shurkin in Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.